Hi, it's Katrina. Valle dei Mulini. The Valle dei Mulini, or the Valley of the Mills in English, is a fascinating abandoned village in Italy that's been completely overgrown by nature. Trees growing out of ceilings, moss covering the walls, and critters living in every nook and cranny. But the Valley of the Mills is even more interesting than just a bunch of abandoned structures from the 13th century. These structures themselves are sitting inside of a deep crack in the bedrock of the earth, a huge split that formed about 35,000 years ago. By geological standards, that's extremely recent. The eruption would have devastated the Mediterranean region, and it caused fissures to break open in the planet. Italians decided to take advantage of the natural stream flowing through the volcanic valley. Of course, by then it was full of greenery and life, so nobody probably thought it was volcanic. All they knew was that the water moved through the valley in ample quantities and that they could use it to their advantage. The flour mills were built and more industrial outfits soon sprang up in the valley as well. There was a sawmill, a wash house, and a whole little village of industrious locals. But disaster struck in the 1940s when the milling of flour shifted to the nearby pasta mills. The industry dried up, the valley was abandoned, and now it's being reclaimed by nature. Keep in mind that as of 2019, the local council voted to restore the Valley of the Mills, and so its old and rustic look may soon be gone. Madain Saleh. Madain Saleh was called Hegra by the Nabatean people who built it. The ancient desert city is hiding in the north of Saudi Arabia, carved into the shadows of giant boulders the size of city blocks. They carved their city out of the natural stones standing in the red wasteland, and it's been sitting undisturbed for about 2,000 years. It was only this decade that Saudi Arabia opened the site up for tourists, allowing them to come and see one of the greatest abandoned cities of the ancient world. If you're thinking to yourself that Hegra looks an awful lot like the site of Petra, that's because they were made by the same people. The Nabateans had Petra as their capital a few hundred miles to the north in Jordan, while Hegra was their secondary city. It was more of a trading hub, their southerly outpost where caravans could take a rest. It was a megalithic city that played a huge role in the spice trade. In fact, the Nabateans controlled all of the spice moving to places like Greece, Rome, Egypt, and Phoenicia. Particularly, they had a monopoly on frankincense and myrrh. And while that may not sound impressive to us today, it was important enough 2,000 years ago that the Nabateans became filthy rich. They became so rich that the Romans annexed their entire civilization in the 1st century AD and pushed them into extinction. A century or two later, the Romans then abandoned Hegra, and it remained mostly empty ever since. The Getty Ruins. The Getty Ruins can be found in Kenya, and it is a uniquely African lost city from the Middle Ages. In fact, some consider the Getty Ruins to be one of the biggest mysteries in all of Africa. The ruins can be found just off the coast of the Indian Ocean, buried deep in one of Kenya's thickest and wildest rainforests. What we do know about the city is that it most likely came into existence around the 13th century, although there is absolutely no hard evidence for that. Scientists are not only baffled about who built the town and when, but also why and when it was abandoned. All that remains these days are the ruins of coral brick houses, these stone pillars of a mosque and a palace, and yet it was once a thriving metropolis. The city was even more advanced than some places in Europe even today. There were neatly aligned streets, running water, and flushing toilets, all the luxuries of an advanced society. Archaeologists have even found artifacts from all over the world here, from Ming Chinese vases to Venetian glass made in Italy. Whoever lived in this coastal town had trade networks all over the world. And yet sometime in the past few hundred years, everybody left and never came back. Old Kinzersk. Old Kinzersk is an abandoned cave city located on a steep slope of a gorge in the middle of absolutely nowhere, Armenia. Back in the 17th and 18th centuries, over 8,000 people lived in the subterranean city, which was filled with everything that would have been in any normal Armenian city above ground. People lived in their own private homes. There were schools to educate their children, a bar for the villagers, a church for prayers, and even multiple cheese factories. Everybody knows you can't live underground without a consistent supply of cheese. To this day, there remain about 2,000 cave dwellings scattered across the gorge. Each of the dwellings housed anywhere between 12 and 25 people. How many people lived in each cave depended on how much money the family had. The wealthier the clan, the more money they could pay for a respected craftsman to make their cave nicer. The caves were continuously occupied right until 1958. That was when the government decided it was time for everyone to come out of their dank and dark dwellings and join the modern world. These days, there is a local businessman who runs some tours of the place. He is working to preserve it for future generations, and he just so happens to have been one of the last people born inside the cave city. Lusonium. Lusonium was a great wooden fortress at the edge of the Roman frontier to the east. The gigantic fortress was built at the Danubian Limes, which was what the Romans called the frontier at the edge of their kingdom. This was where the Danube River separated Rome from modern Hungary, Slovakia, Serbia, Bulgaria, and Romania. For the Romans, everyone beyond this line was a barbarian savage, and they also proved impossible to subjugate. When the Romans realized there was no hope of invading farther east, they stopped and built a wall. Not a long, unbreaking wall of stone and earth, but an extensive series of fortifications. Huge earthen ramparts, palisades, watchtowers, legion camps, and fortresses. This line of defense was to keep the barbarians out of Roman territory. Lusonium was one of the biggest and most impressive frontier fortresses. It was built in the 1st century AD, either under the rule of Roman Emperor Claudius or Emperor Nero. It's not exactly clear which one. The fortress was built primarily of wood and earth, but stone was added 300 years later to create an even more impressive fortress. Then, something happened shortly after, and the whole fortress was torn apart and replaced with a smaller construct of wood, with an adjacent stone watchtower. About 500 to 1,000 soldiers would have guarded this fortress. They would have been charged with defending the line against the Sarmatians, who lived on the other side of the river. A small town would have sprung up around the fortress to accommodate the soldiers, and it would have been a pretty bustling area. Then, around 500 years after the fortress was built, it was abandoned. By the 5th century AD, the barbarians had started moving closer to Rome, and the fortress had to be evacuated. The Romans fled for their lives. The haunted Scottish village. There is an ancient traditional village in Scotland that's totally abandoned, and that's supposedly haunted by an old seer. It's one of the spookiest abandoned places in the UK, called the Old Village of Lars. As of 2021, the place was up for sale for just around $150,000. And yet, even though it had an attractive price tag, locals say it also comes with a restless spirit. The old village is considered an ancient monument situated on the northern shore of Loch Tay in the rural region of Perthshire. One of the ruined buildings in the village is called the Laird's House, and that's where the locals say the spirit of the seer resides. According to Scottish history, she was something of a local witch who made predictions of the future. In the 17th century, she allegedly predicted the invention of steamships and trains. We don't know how much of this is true, and nobody knows if her spirit really is haunting the place. The history in the village goes back to at least 1473, but it was down to only 17 residents by 1841, according to the official UK census list. By the 20th century, the whole place was deserted. Ajina Tepe. Ajina Tepe is an ancient abandoned Buddhist cloister. A cloister is kind of like a monastery, one that's isolated from the rest of the world. It can be found these days just a few miles from the city of Otar in Tajikistan. It really is in the middle of nowhere, hidden in rural Central Asia. And yet, according to the UNESCO World Heritage Center, Ajina Tepe has outstanding universal value. It's an amazing site with a rich and mysterious history, and it goes back nearly 1,500 years. Even though Tajikistan and the surrounding nations are predominantly Muslim these days, there was a major resurgence of Buddhism starting in the 7th century. Buddhist cloisters like Ajina Tepe sprang up like wildflowers. There was a resting Buddha statue built here, a monumental creation roughly 40 feet in length. Archaeologists have also discovered statues and carvings from Buddhist mythology and striking Buddhist murals from the 7th century. Unfortunately, the whole operation didn't seem to last very long. Within just 100 years, everyone appears to have abandoned the sacred site. The people simply left. The monk dwellings were all left to rot, and nobody really took any notice of it until the 1960s. By then, Ajina Tepe was almost completely in ruins. Guayabo de Turrialba. Guayabo de Turrialba is an abandoned jungle city in Costa Rica that is not very well known to the general public. There may be plenty of fantastic archaeological sites across Mexico and Guatemala, but Costa Rica barely gets any attention. There were plenty of fascinating societies living in Central America, societies just as noteworthy as the more popular Maya from the north. The physical location of Guayabo de Turrialba was believed to be occupied starting around the year 1000 BC. That was right around the time Jerusalem was founded, just to put things into perspective. Then the population steadily grew. The city became larger and more advanced, and it peaked in the 9th century AD with a population of about 10,000 people. It was the main center in the region for both politics and religion, and yet the entire society was almost certainly based on farming. They farmed just enough food to keep all of their bellies full, while trying not to go to war with all of their neighbors in the north, like the Aztecs and the Maya. Unfortunately, archaeologists don't actually have a name for the people who built this place. We only know that they were a highly advanced society, likely as innovative as the Maya, but not as expansive. They didn't leave behind such grand cities and impressive ruins as found in Mexico, and archaeologists don't even know what to call them. They abandoned the city at Guayabo de Turrialba in the year 1400, about 100 years before the Spanish conquistadors showed up. We still have no idea why they left, as it appears to have happened quickly and for no obvious reason. Gamsutol. Gamsutol is one of the oldest settlements in the entire region of Mount Gamsutolmir in Russia. The town itself is situated high up at the mountain's peak, 4,600 feet above sea level. It's also known as the Machu Picchu of Russia. While the village may be ancient, it's currently abandoned and in ruins. It's also so far out of the way that getting to this place is like trying to climb to the roof of the world. In fact, Gamsutol actually translates in the local ethnic language to "at the foot of the Khan's fortress." For this reason, most historians believe it was a local Khan who wanted to build the greatest fortification anyone had ever seen, and so he ordered a great castle, fortress, and city to be built at the peak of the mountain. Here's where things get a little mysterious. Nobody actually knows how old the city is. Some estimates say 2,000 years, and some say 5,000 years. All we know is what the archaeological evidence tells us, which honestly isn't much. At its peak, Gamsutol only had about 300 houses, meaning maybe 1,000 citizens or less. However, they lasted all the way into the 20th century, when the village was still a bustling place filled with life and energy. There were shops, a post office, and even a hospital to treat the sick. The people who lived there were completely isolated. The only way to reach the mountain village is by driving to a nearby town called Chok, then hiking over 2 hours into the foothills using ancient pathways. From there, you still have to climb to the top of the mountain. Sadly though, 2015 saw the death of the very last remaining resident, and now there is nobody living in this ancient place, and all 70 of the remaining homes are slowly crumbling. Carlaveroc Castle. Carlaveroc Castle stood for only 50 years before it was forsaken. The castle, located in Scotland near Dumfries, was home to the Maxwell family in the 13th century. The family was so rich that 50 years after they built the original castle, they had a new one built just a few yards away and moved into that. They completely abandoned the first one, leaving it to rot in the year 1270. Fun fact, it is the only castle in the shape of a triangle in all of Britain. Up until now, Scottish historians had simply assumed the family wanted an upgrade to reflect their wealth. But according to Stefan Sagrot with the Historic Environment Scotland, it may have actually had something to do with extreme weather events. The original Carlaveroc Castle may have experienced a prolonged period of flooding, which made life living in the castle utterly miserable. But rather than building a new home many miles away, The Maxwell family simply had a new castle built just far enough away from the flooding for it not to be affected. The new castle remains almost completely preserved to this day and is considered one of the best pieces of Scottish medieval architecture. On the other hand, the original Carlaveroc castle is very rapidly falling apart. Weris megaliths. In the small Belgian village of Weris, not far from Luxembourg, there is a group of megalithic monuments called the Weris megaliths. These enormous structures are scattered over an area of about 5 miles long and form a unique set of ancient stone pillars from a bygone age. There are multiple standing stones, along with old chamber tombs called dolmens, and it all dates back to roughly 3000 BC. That was about 5,000 years ago, at a time when the mysterious Sen-Oise-Marne culture dominated this part of Europe. Because these stone creations were built so long ago, researchers don't know that much about them. The dolmens are definitely burial tombs. The bodies had been buried deep underground, with the graves covered over by gigantic rocks, and then rough slabs of stone were placed over the graves to protect them. Dolmens were the earliest types of tombs, a rudimentary step up from burial cairns that were basically just piles of rocks thrown over a body. Sadly, by the time archaeologists discovered the tombs, they had already been pillaged and picked through. Very little is known of what was inside them, and for that matter, very little is known about the standing stones scattered about in the region. No one knows if the megalithic stones were used for travel markers, if they had something to do with astronomy, or if they were just put there for fun. Maybe all of the above. Whalebone Alley. In 1976, archaeologists in the Soviet Union came across a strange structure in Siberia. They uncovered 2 parallel rows of whale bones that had been jabbed into the snow to create a kind of morbid arched walkway. It's almost like a portal, made of whale jaw and rib bones that tower about 16 feet high and weigh about 660 pounds each. There were a total of 34 whale bones discovered, and they all belonged to bowhead whales. These would have been easy enough to catch even for primitive Siberians. But the real mystery has been trying to figure out who created Whalebone Alley and why. This curious archaeological site is located on Itigran Island in the Bering Sea. It's actually only a few miles from the coast of Alaska. Whoever created the creepy, weird structures would have done so a very long time before the Russians ever claimed Siberia for themselves. The site is at least 600 years old, still somehow in almost perfect condition. The bones were shoved into the ground and then propped up straight with rocks, and nothing has pushed them over in nearly a millennia. 40 years after the discovery, scientists are still scratching their heads. People call it Siberia's answer to Stonehenge, although it's definitely more ominous. The best guess archaeologists have for the purpose of Whalebone Alley is that it was built by Inuit tribes as a kind of neutral place of peace. Think of it like a demilitarized zone where various chiefs could discuss their issues without fear of repercussions. Iwami Ginzan Silver Mine. In Japan, the Iwami Ginzan silver mine was one of the premier silver mines in the world starting in 1527. For just shy of 400 years, the mine produced flawless silver and made the townsfolk and many people of the Shimane prefecture quite wealthy. Japan copied the method of refining silver from their neighbors in Korea in 1533. Thanks to the Koreans, the Japanese learned how to melt silver ore into an alloy to better extract the silver, which greatly increased their silver production. But what's really amazing is the whole area of Iwami Ginzan is basically stuck in time. There are over 1,000 mine shafts spread throughout the forest, so many that a person could get lost and never see the light of day again. The small town of Omori, which sprang up beside the mine, is also a historical treasure, and a fascinating and strange one at that. It's still home to an ancient magistrate's office, residences of real samurai who may have been used to protect the silver and the mine's overlords, and mysterious cave shrines carved into the mountainside. The town itself doesn't look like it's changed much since the 16th century. Nayang Ohak. Nayang Ohak is a surreal place in Myanmar filled with crumbling jungle temples. It's not on any popular tourist map, And people definitely aren't flying all over the world to see this strange place. And yet, it is one of the most jaw-dropping archaeological sites in Southeast Asia. It's situated next to the beautiful Inle Lake and appears to be something out of a fairy tale. This site is extremely difficult to reach. The only way there is to travel by boat into the middle of absolutely nowhere and then walk to the rustic village of Indane, where people are still living simple, disconnected lives. Then, on the outskirts of the peaceful and traditional village, there is Nayang Ohak. It's a small collection of Buddhist stupas that date back to the 17th century, roughly 400 years ago. The history behind each and every stupa has mostly been lost, and very little has been done to keep them from falling apart. It's almost like a graveyard of temples, with rich mosaics falling off the walls, shoeless children playing in the dirt, trees growing out of the peaked ceilings, and cracked Buddha statues gradually decaying into nothing. Sidon. Sidon is a very old city originally inhabited by the Phoenicians. It's located in what is today Lebanon, just a few miles south of Beirut. And although the city of Sidon may not look that special, it was once the most wealthy and powerful city-state in all of Phoenicia. The people here made a name for themselves by manufacturing purple dye and then shipping it around the world. The color purple was made famous by the craftsmen of Sidon and was so rare and expensive that it quickly became synonymous with royalty. This was over 2,000 years ago. And yet, even though so much time has passed, purple is still directly associated with people of extreme wealth and royal families around the world. And it's all because of one Phoenician city. But that's not all Sidon was known for. It was inhabited at least 6,000 years ago, producing massive amounts of glass in the 8th century BC, and they were known for being particularly cosmopolitan. In antiquity, Sidon could have been compared to somewhere like San Francisco for its progressiveness. In fact, Princess Jezebel came from Sidon and was the daughter of King Ethbal. She was mentioned in the Bible, and so too is Sidon multiple times. This city was such a big deal for so many centuries that everyone knew where it was. It was so popular that it managed to spread Phoenician culture across much of the known world. This was the city that ruled them all, up until the Phoenician civilization began to face internal problems. The government fell apart, and Rome took control after the death of Alexander the Great in 332 BC. Gyanse Tsong. A tsong is a very distinctive type of architectural building found primarily in the hermit countries of Bhutan and Tibet. These are some of the most isolated places in the world, ancient civilizations that have been reduced to obscurity and are hidden away along the border of China in a region nearly impossible to reach. And although most people don't consider Bhutan and Tibet to be all that important historically, especially compared to somewhere like Rome, they were both major players in Asia. Humans have lived in both regions for thousands of years, and because of their isolation, they developed their own unique architectural styles and cultural nuances. The Tsong was a kind of fortified monastery with great towering walls to surround an interior complex of courtyards, temples, and monk dwellings. A tsong could serve as a military or administrative complex, or even as a social center for an entire region. Arguably, the most impressive tsong still standing is the Gyanse Tsong in Tibet, finished in 1390 AD to guard Lhasa and the entrance to the Sangpo Valley. Today, the ancient fortress is situated high above the small town of Gyanse on a spur of jagged brown rock. There would have been no way into the fortress without scaling the rock or climbing the stairs, and so the chance of invasion was quite slim. The original fortress began construction around 838 AD, but it wasn't until 1268 that the massive walls were constructed around it. The palace was built in 1365 by a local prince named Pakpa Peltsangpo, and the whole place reached its height by the turn of the 15th century. Alas, the one thing the Tibetan people had never expected was the British. When the British showed up in Tibet, the defenders of Gyanse Tsong were outmatched. They had spears and slingshots and extremely out-of-date matchlock guns, while the British had unstoppable machine guns. The Brits took the fortress, raised the Union Jack, and that was the start of British rule. Senegambian stone circles. When we think about stone circles, our minds almost immediately go to England and Western Europe, but outside of places like Stonehenge and the Karnak stones in France, there are still monumental stone circles, like the ones in Gambia, called the Senegambian stone circles. This isn't just one circle of stones, but multiple circles, about 1,000 of them spread across a massive area over 100 miles long. Even though not many people have heard of this place, it is actually the largest concentration of stone circles anywhere in the world. This was a sacred landscape used by the ancient residents of Gambia in Africa for over 1,500 years. It's been considered one of the greatest archaeological marvels on Earth since it was inscribed on the UNESCO World Heritage List in 2006. But believe it or not, this site isn't alone. Spread between Senegal and Gambia are 29,000 stones, 17,000 monuments, and 2,000 sites that are almost identical. The monuments all consist of upright pillars, many that still stand as straight as the day they were laid. The big surprise is that nobody knows what they were used for. Researchers aren't even sure exactly when the monuments were built, but agree it was most likely around the 3rd century BC. Burial mounds have been found dating back to 927 AD, but there could be older ones never uncovered. The stone monuments were almost certainly used for ritual purposes, and yet there is no hard evidence. But there is hard evidence of an extraordinary society here. The dedication to move and shape 29,000 stones would have required a prosperous civilization. But we don't know who they were, where they went, or even if they had great cities in the area. Herodium. Herodium was the megalithic palace of Herod I, aka Herod the Great. It was built at the top of a hill in Israel around the year 23 BC. At this time, Herod was the king of Judea, but technically subservient to the Roman Empire. Herod is particularly famous these days for his ambitious building projects. He was also behind the fortress of Masada, the great tomb of the patriarchs, and a costly renovation of the Second Temple in Jerusalem. But out of all of his great building projects, Herodium was one of the greatest. According to the Roman Jewish historian Josephus, the king built his great city palace on the very spot where he fought a great battle against the last Hasmonean king, Antigonus. The palace was then built into one of the most fabulous places of the ancient world. It was rich with sprouting gardens, stables for the horses, a luxurious pool complex, and an endless supply of water brought up the hill by a system of highly advanced aqueducts and reservoirs. There was one main palace at the top and then a second palace even bigger on the lower flanks of the hill. These days, it's hard to imagine Herodium's greatness. The place is now a dusty ruin without a drop of water in sight. Runestone Hill. Runestone Hill in Sweden, also called Runstenskollen, isn't your average archaeological site. In fact, it's really just a tiny mound in the center of Lund outside the local university. It takes us back to a bygone age of Vikings and magical runestones. These stones never actually came from this spot, but were brought to the university from various sites across Scandinavia. Each runestone is only about 3 feet tall, and they were placed on a mound in a tight circle in the way they may have been placed hundreds of years ago. Each stone is inscribed with runic text, describing the deaths of Vikings in northern Europe. For example, the Valleberga stone was discovered back in 1845, being used as a fence post by some country folk. Written on the stone are the names of Man and Sven. These were 2 Vikings who likely lived in Tingaladet, England, back in the 11th century AD. That was shortly after the Nordic conquest of England in 1016. According to the stone, these 2 warriors fell in battle and were buried in London, and now their stone is keeping their memory alive all the way in Sweden. Lake Monroe. Lake Monroe is one of the most interesting archaeological sites in Indiana. Although to be fair, the lake itself isn't an archaeological site. It's more of a concentration of different sites. Back in 1976, researchers with Indiana University discovered over 100 different places of archaeological value surrounding the lake, with at least one of them being the most important in all of Indiana, and maybe even the United States. All of these decades later, work is still being done to uncover the mysteries of who lived at Lake Monroe. Epsilon 2 is the most famous site at the lake. All kinds of spear points were found here. Arrowheads, mollusk shells, pieces of pottery, animal bones, and everything having to do with human existence in the centuries before Europeans arrived. The artifacts date back to the Archaic period of North America. This was between 8000 BC and 1000 BC, and was a time when Native Americans were practicing an economy of nuts, seeds, and shellfish. They had also recently adopted farming, which began to change the topography of the Americas. We don't actually know which group lived on the shores of the lake, and no large structures have ever been identified. All we have are old artifacts, arrowheads, and proof that very primitive people had made their home on the shores of this lake, likely in many small settlements. Lost City of Caesars. The Wandering City, or the City of Caesars, supposedly existed once in the land of Patagonia, a great natural landscape spanning much of Chile and Argentina. According to accounts from ancient history, the city was rich in gold and diamonds. The people of the Wandering City were described as having strangely pale skin and being as tall as giants. The city's existence has been debated for over 200 years, and nobody has ever found evidence that it truly did exist. The origin of the city takes us back to 1515. Spanish explorer Juan de Solis was attacked by Native Americans while on an expedition near what is present-day Buenos Aires. The survivors were forced to trek inland, deep into the forbidding lands of Patagonia, and that was when they came upon a beautiful city inhabited by a race of tall, pale men. Juan de Solis and his men shared stories of the city with other Spaniards. In 1528, Jesuit missionaries and explorer Francisco Cesar went searching for the city, believing it to be an island of salvation. They never found it. In 1540, a ship was wrecked off the coast of Patagonia, and about 200 lives were lost. Then, in 1563, 23 years after the disaster, 2 members of the crew returned to civilization and told the story of how they survived and came across a city filled with treasure. This was supposedly the City of Caesars. And yet, for all these crazy stories and supposed sightings, nobody in modern times has ever laid eyes on the place. Herperion. Herperion was inhabited starting in 5000 BC. 7,000 years ago, primitive human beings lived on this great forested hill in what is now Bulgaria. The early settlement eventually became a Thracian holy sanctuary, and later a Roman town. The history of this lost city is extremely complex. Legend tells us that during the days of ancient Thrace, the Temple of Dionysus was built here. From within the temple were said great prophecies by oracles. In 334 BC, Alexander the Great traveled to the Temple of Dionysus to have his fortune told. The oracle told Alexander that he would live to conquer the world, and that was exactly what he did. Oddly enough, the same thing was said to Gaius Octavius when he visited the oracle at the temple in 59 BC, almost 300 years later. He was told that his son, a child who would grow to be the great Emperor Augustus, would rule the world. Herperion was one of the few places not destroyed by the Romans during their warmongering. It was originally built as a religious sanctuary by the Thracians, but when the Romans took over the territory for good around the 1st century AD, they expanded it into a city instead of destroying it. It was only destroyed in the 4th century when the Goths showed up and smashed everything in their path. In the 6th century, Herperion experienced a brief revival. Christian churches were built and it became a military stronghold in medieval days. But after the 13th century, the place was widely abandoned and became lost. Now, the historic site is littered with the ruins of houses, altars, tombs, and sacred sites, all on the top of a tall hill overlooking the beautiful Bulgarian countryside. The Lost City of Indiana Jones. In Indiana Jones and Raiders of the Lost Ark, the Nazis discover a mysterious lost city while hunting for the Ark of the Covenant. They found the city of Tannis in Egypt, buried by a sandstorm thousands of years ago. And while most of what you see in the Indiana Jones movie is far removed from reality, Tannis is in fact a real place.
It has absolutely nothing to do with the Nazis, and there was no Ark, but it is a real lost city with a shocking past. Tannis was the capital of the 21st and 22nd dynasties of ancient Egypt. It was ruled over by the Tannite kings in what is called the Third Intermediate Period. It became a wealthy commercial center, fueled by the water of the Nile Delta. According to National Geographic, the rulers of Tannis were unique in that they came from Libya, not from the traditional Egyptian families. The Third Intermediate Period was one of the most chaotic times in Egyptian history, with widespread violence, famine, and anarchy. This was a time of weak government and lawlessness, as well as poorly kept historical records. We don't know what happened to the city. It seems to have vanished by 664 BC, and although it wasn't technically buried by a sandstorm, it was lost to the desert. The Nile Delta dried up, and the whole place became an arid salt flat. The city wasn't uncovered again until 1939 by French archaeologist Pierre Montet. It was one of the biggest discoveries of the 20th century, with the city found nearly in the exact same condition as when it was abandoned 2,500 years earlier. Otar. The ancient city of Otar is not the easiest place to get to. It's a ghost town located in modern Kazakhstan, originally a city along the legendary Silk Road. It was one of the most important places in Central Asia, sitting in the middle of a lush oasis. The region, although now totally barren and empty, was once beautiful, but the water has since dried up. The residents have long left, and the city was covered for centuries by raging sandstorms. It was wildly important 2,000 years ago because it sat at a crossroads between China and Europe, the Near East and Middle East, and the tribes of Siberia to the north. It's not clear when the first people lived here, but the first residents were almost certainly part of the Persian Empire around 550 BC. The city then maintained its prosperity up until the Mongol invasion of 1219. Genghis Khan besieged the city, breached its walls, and massacred everyone inside. This led to almost every town within a day's journey being abandoned and covered in sand. After the Khan's death, Otar rose from the dead to become a bustling trade center once again. It continued to flourish, but things were never really the same. The city was captured by everyone from the Uzbeks to the Dzungars. But it was ultimately the Silk Road losing its importance in the 17th century that caused Otar to become a lost ghost town in the middle of an unoccupied desert. Want to say a big thank you to Jen Giesenhoff and Alan Viggins. Thanks so much for watching and supporting Origins Explained. If you are new here, welcome, and be sure to subscribe if you haven't already. Adulus. Recent expeditions have discovered what could be the oldest Christian church in the Horn of Africa. 3 churches were discovered in the ancient city of Adulus, located north of Ethiopia in the little-known nation of Eritrea. The churches are ancient, with one of them dating back to the second half of the 4th century AD. This was just after the Edict of Milan, when Constantine the Great, Emperor of Rome, decriminalized Christianity and took the first step into creating a Christian Europe. What this means is that the church in this lost city was one of the very first official Christian structures in North Africa. The city itself dates back to around the 1st century AD. It was important in the Aksumite kingdom as a trading hub. It was a stop on a road that was not quite as famous as the Silk Road or the Amber Road, but one that facilitated trade east to west. This was a crucial trading route for much of Africa and one of the core centers that made the Aksumites of Ethiopia so rich. It's unclear what exactly happened to the city, but it vanished from the historical records in the 7th century. It was rediscovered about 1,000 years later on an ancient map, then discovered by outsiders at the end of the 19th century. The city appears to have been flooded, perhaps by a sudden burst from the Uwadi Hadas River. The most interesting part of this city is still the church. The ruin of the old sanctuary is a reminder that North Africa was one of the most powerful and devout Christian regions at the beginning of Christianity. They celebrated Christ long before the religion really took a foothold in Rome. Ancient sunken village. A sunken village with Viking origins has just emerged in Yorkshire from a dried-up reservoir. Record drought in the United Kingdom caused the water levels of the Batings Reservoir to plummet, revealing a lost village that hasn't been seen since the 1950s. It was called Batings, and it was famous up until it was submerged for its pack-horse bridge. The bridge was centuries old, originally used to bring supplies on pack horses through the Pennine Hills. This linked ancient Yorkshire with ancient Lancaster. It's believed the village was settled by people of Norse origins, possibly Vikings, around 1,000 years ago. It thrived in ancient days and then developed rapidly in the Industrial Revolution. But like so many towns that had done well prior to industrialization, Batings began to suffer in the 21st century. By the time it was decided to flood the city to make a reservoir, very few residents remained. This has been the first time that the ruins of the lost village have been seen since it was flooded. The only other time the reservoir levels fell dangerously low was in 1989. That was when a man named Lawrence Winstanley was found with a gunshot wound to his head and tied to a heavy pickaxe. He had been murdered the year prior and dumped in the reservoir. His murder has never been solved. Cowpang. Established around the year 780, Cowpang was a thriving Viking town on the western edge of Norway. It wasn't as big as some of the other major Viking towns in Sweden and Denmark, such as Birka and Hedeby, but it was a bustling city and a prosperous place to live. It had high economic importance and was the site of much trade with people from faraway lands. Scholars believe Cowpang to be the oldest functioning city in Norway. Just shy of 100 years after it was founded, the city ran into some troubles. The land was extremely fertile, and this was making the kings from other Viking territories jealous. Historical records from 813 show that Danish kings battled for control of the region. There are no historical records of any great bloody battles, but it doesn't really matter because by the 10th century, the whole place was abandoned. Other cities such as Tonsberg and Skien rose up in Norway, growing more rapidly and becoming more prosperous than Cowpang, and the city just kind of fell to the wayside. One theory archaeologists have is that the water level dropped. There may have been a short span of time in which boats could no longer dock at the city, making trade impossible. The city was then lost and abandoned, and only recently excavated in 1956. Khe Thum. In the 1980s, the ancient Thai temple of Khe Thum was used as a refugee camp. Originally a Hindu monument and sanctuary for Lord Shiva, it became a sanctuary for Cambodians fleeing their civil war. The temple was in a state of great disrepair, falling to pieces and littered with landmines. The only people who visited the temple were warlords, displaced refugees, and gun dealers. 40 years later, things are very different. The temple of Khe Thum is now a popular tourist site and has been rebuilt. People are coming to this ancient place in the jungle to learn of its mysterious history. The temple was originally part of the powerful Khmer Empire, one of the greatest kingdoms the world has ever seen. It was connected to other major sites, temples and cities, all the way to Prasat Wat Phu in Laos. Construction began in 937 under the rule of King Jayavarman IV, then was completed in 1052. In the 11th century, this wasn't only a temple, it was a small village. People from the local rice farming communities tended the sacred structure. People lived in its shadow, and it was a lively community of Hindus and then Buddhists. It was shortly after the temple was built that it was abandoned. Like much of the Khmer Empire, the temple was lost. The farming communities died, and the whole thing was reclaimed by nature. It was abandoned and lost, and wasn't found again until a French explorer came along in the 19th century. Nore. Nore was already a lost city when Pliny the Elder wrote of its existence in the 1st century AD. Julius Caesar claimed it was the capital of the Celtic kingdom of Noricum, located somewhere in the Eastern Alps, most likely southern Austria. The location of this lost city has never been uncovered, nor has its existence ever been officially verified. What we do know based on Roman historical records is that the Celtic kingdom of Noricum was a primary provider of weaponry. These Celtic people had developed an unprecedented method for forging steel. Roman swords may have been made from the best quality steel available, but it wasn't the Romans who made them. They purchased the weapons from the Celtic forge masters. The Celts were forging superior steel starting around the year 500 BC, and they became hugely wealthy by trading these weapons to the Romans. In the days of the Roman Republic, prior to the Roman Empire of the 1st century, Noricum was one of their major allies. They traded weapons for protection. It was a formal military alliance, with the Celts operating from their mystical city in the mountains called Nore. In 16 BC, Noricum was absorbed by Rome, and the location of their great city has since been lost. The Lost Cities of Dubai. The desert kingdom of the United Arab Emirates is rich in ancient history. The great city of Dubai might be one of the most technologically advanced in the 21st century. But just beyond its borders, out in the dry and barren wasteland of the desert, there are lost cities thousands of years old. The truth is that people have been living on the Arabian Peninsula for over 100,000 years. First, it was primitive cave people hunting and foraging. These people later turned into farmers, and eventually civilizations that mastered bronze and other technologies. One of the most important places in the ancient world was the land of Magan, near the modern border of Oman. It was one of the first major suppliers for bronze tools throughout the Middle East. It functioned at a time when some of the greatest cities in Sumer were flourishing, such as Ur and Uruk. Just north of Al Ain, archaeologists have uncovered tombs, buildings, and strange ruins where the stones were cut so precisely you can't even get a piece of floss between them. The technological innovations here were impressive, especially since the stonework dates back 4,700 years. One of the largest cities found in the region is that of Mleha, that goes back roughly 2,000 years. This city was about a mile wide and was inhabited for roughly 500 years. It was abandoned around the 1st century and slowly covered by sand. It's one of many lost cities out here in the Arabian desert, many of which have never been found. Thanks for watching! Which of these amazing lost cities would you love to have explored before it was lost? Let me know in the comments below, and be sure to subscribe if you haven't already. See you soon! Bye!